Welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games, where we feed our people with relatable content, and our victory condition is your satisfaction. I'm Harry, and today we have another top 10 list for you all. Today I'm going to be sharing with you guys my top 10 dungeon crawler board games. And this is a very popular category of games and a favorite of mine. I play these type of games quite often, sometimes by myself, sometimes in bigger groups, but either way, I always enjoy the experience. Now, one caveat before I go any further is I am lumping up all types of fantasy adventure, overland, hex crawl style of games, along with dungeon crawlers, all into one list. Lots of people like to separate these into two different lists. I am not limiting this list to games that take place within a dungeon environment or within some type of labyrinth or tight, closed, confined, dark space. Some of these games include open areas, broad daylight areas, wilderness areas, and what have you. But usually what these games have in common is quite often they have some type of fantastical theme to them. It usually encompasses different heroes or a band of heroes joining together, fighting bad guys, fighting monsters, ultimately fighting the big bad, the overlord, the boss. They are acquiring weapons and spells and loot and treasure, and they're going to shop and they're leveling up their characters. Sometimes the leveling up takes place mid-game. Sometimes the leveling up process takes place in between games or in the larger campaign that might be taking place in some of these type of games. But one way or another, characters are getting stronger, they're getting more efficient, they're getting more effective, and at the same time, the competition, the opposition, the bad guys, the opponents, the evil are usually getting stronger as well in harmony or in proportion to what the heroes are doing as well. So that's pretty much it as far as my caveats. So again, these are just fantasy adventure games, but I'm lumping them up as dungeon crawl games. And these are my 10 favorite. But before we go any further, I do want to have a few shout outs, a few honorable mentions, 3 honorable mentions to be precise. So let's start with my number 13. And my number 13 is Dungeon Quest. And this is a classic game here from the late 1980s. I believe 1987 was when it was first published. And Games Workshop, I believe, published it back then. But this right here is Fantasy Flight, their 3rd edition. Fantasy Flight also did a 4th edition a few years back as well. And Dungeon Quest is literally a dungeon crawl. The heroes in this game are basically against one another. It's kind of like a race, a competition. They're all trying to go and traverse through the corridors of this dungeon here. And it's a tile placement game because as you progress through the dungeon, you're revealing tiles and placing them on the board to show what kind of room you're entering in. And all of these rooms come with their own different challenges. They're bad guys that might be there, different types of encounters and traps and puzzles and different types of calamities, bad things that could happen to the heroes. And quite often what happens is these things cause you damage. And in this game, you can have player elimination, although there is a variant, and that's the way I play it, where players are not eliminated. Instead, they're reduced to half of their hit points, and they have to discard a few of their loot items. And the loot is basically the point of the game. You're trying to make it to the center of the dungeon here, which is the Dragon's Chamber, and basically sneak in there without waking up the dragon, stealing some loot, and trying to escape back to the corner, the towers of the dungeon, to escape and ultimately be the winner by being the person to A, survive, and B, had the most loot that they acquired throughout the process. It's a fun game, very random, very luck-based, but it's, again, a classic in this style of game, and I have to give it credit for its brilliance, especially for its time, 1980s, and just the fun experience of all the different encounter cards that are available in this game. My number 13 dungeon crawler, Dungeon Quest. And now we move on to a second honorable mention, my number 12. And again, just like with Dungeon Quest, I just have to give a nod to Talisman here. And Talisman, also from the 1980s. I believe this was published first in 1983. So this is an old game. And this game has had such an influence on the genre of fantasy-themed board games and dungeon crawl board games in particular. And this game is a game that I was on the fence about for quite some time, and most people are, because in essence, it is a roll and move game. You roll your dice, and the dice tell you how you move along the board. The only option you really have is, do you move towards the left, or do you move right? Do you move clockwise or counterclockwise? Other than that, you're relegated to the number on the die roll. But it's really cool because you have different characters, And the base game alone comes with 14 different characters, and the characters have different stats. They have their strength, they have their craft, and these tell you how good they are at either physical combat or psychic combat. They have their life points, which tells you how much damage they can sustain before they are eliminated from the game. This is also an elimination-based game, and the ultimate objective of the players are to make it to the center of the board, the innermost region, the crown of command, and from there they will pick off the rest of the opponents and ultimately eliminate it from the game and be the victor. This game takes a long time to play. However, I play this heavily house ruled. I play this quite often solo, with some solo variants that I have perused through the internet and have come up with on my own as well. And I play with some modifications that the rulebook suggests to make the game quicker, which is basically leveling up the character a little bit from early on, from the get-go. That way they start a little bit stronger and can progress through the different terrains at a more rapid pace. So this game definitely involves lots of house rules. I cannot say that it is the most strategic game either, but it's a fun experience. If you allow yourself, you can kind of get yourself into the mode. It's a beer and pretzel type of game. You need the right group, the right spirit, the right attitude. But again, it's just revolutionary for its time, the early 1980s, and basically very influential to lots of the fantasy-themed games that came out afterward, and that's why I'm giving it a little shout-out here as my number 12, Talisman. And now we move on to the last honorable mention, my number 11, and it is HeroQuest. And this game has been getting lots of buzz lately due to the recently delivered and much anticipated Kickstarter that lots of people are posting on social media nowadays. I find this on my board game group. I find this on Instagram. It is absolutely everywhere. And this game here is a classic, also from the 1980s, back in 1989. And this game here is a pioneer to the modern dungeon crawl style board games. A lot of the board games that I am going to be mentioning in this top 10 list owe its existence and have been highly influenced by this game. This game is a very fun and easy game to play. You can teach this to a child. The box says ages 9 and up. I think that's about right because it's pretty straightforward. It's pretty basic, and it's so fun to just watch the players, the heroes. One player is going to be the overlord, the bad guy, controlling the evil forces, the dungeon master, if you will, and the other group of players are going to control the heroes. And you need to have 4 heroes no matter how many human players are playing, and they're traversing through the different rooms and corridors of the dungeon here, and the dungeon layout is always going to be slightly different from game to game, from quest to quest, but the characters, the heroes, don't necessarily know what's in a room or down a hallway until they actually enter that room or until they look down that hallway. So as the game progresses, all these things are going to unfold on the board, and later on in the game, you're just going to have this board filled with so much different furniture. It comes with lots of 3-dimensional furniture pieces to adorn your different dungeon rooms, and you're going to have all these different miniatures that are going to be on the board representing the bad guys and the good guys. Lots of cool stuff, nice and neat, simple, straightforward combat. But again, it had to get a mention because of its great influence and its place as a pioneer within the genre. My number 11, HeroQuest. And now we will move on to the top 10 proper. My number 10 dungeon crawl style board game of all time is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And for me, this here is a rare exception on the list. This is one of my few, if not the only, non-fantasy themed game for this list, because it definitely puts me in that spirit. And even so, I guess you could say a bunch of anthropomorphic talking turtles would be a very fantastical sight, right? So this game here, first of all, I'm a big fan of the IP. Big fan growing up of TMNT and just love that experience. And this is also a one versus all type of experience. At least this base game is. I believe some of the future standalone expansions added full cooperative play. But here one player takes on the forces of bad or evil, the Shredder side, if you will, and the other group of players take on the role of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And just like in HeroQuest, no matter how many players are playing, you need all 4 turtles to be in this game. So one player or multiple players might have to control multiple characters if you don't have enough human players to control them. But this game is fun. The base game here does not actually have campaign play. What it does, it has multiple scenarios. I think there's like 16 different scenarios, and they're divided into different sections. And based on who wins the current scenario, that player or that winner gets to choose the next scenario from the following section. So it's a little bit like a campaign, but there's not necessarily too much consequences and not too many opportunities for leveling up, which is why this game here ranks so low. Most of these games here do have lots of opportunities for the characters to evolve and to grow and to strengthen themselves. But again, just for the fact that the individual gameplay is so much fun, the different characters are so asymmetric, and even the differences between how the Overlord player and the actual heroes play is so exciting. Great miniatures, great mechanisms. Big fan of the IP. My number 10 dungeon crawl game, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Shadows of the Past. And now we move on to my number 9. And my number 9 is a small one here, One Deck Dungeon. And I talk about this game quite often. It makes it onto lots of my lists because I'm a big fan of the game. Now, this is definitely a very puzzly dungeon crawler. And basically, the dungeon just consists of 4 face-down cards at a time. You have this deck of cards that you're going to run through. And at any given moment, you can have, at most, 4 doors for you to choose to explore, and you simply flip them face up and you see what's there. And it might be some type of peril, a trap you might have to encounter or overcome, or it might be a monster like this goblin right here, or like this ice elemental. And they all have these different requirements based on the different stats that a hero can have. The heroes have agility, they have combat, they have magic combat, and they have their hearts, their lives, their hit points. And based on their different stats, that corresponds with different types of dice that you roll, and these different types of requirements that you must meet on the different monsters or perils. And here it shows that you need to roll at least one die that has a 4 to cover that box, another die that has a 4 to cover that box. You need a specific number there according to this card, and they must be the yellow types. So you need to know which dice you have to roll and how well you have to roll in each of those particular dice. So there is a lot of luck as far as that's concerned. There is some mitigation because as the game progresses, the characters are leveling up to level 2, level 3, level 4. And what these levels do is they allow them to acquire more loot. They allow them to acquire more items to strengthen their stats. They allow them to gain more skills that quite often give them dice mitigation abilities. They allow them to learn some spells that give them potions that let them do different things that kind of break and tweak the rules in different ways. And ultimately, you're progressing through the deck, and every time you progress through the deck, you go deeper into the dungeon. You go to the next level, and things get a little bit harder. So by then, you're hoping that your character is a lot more powerful. And ultimately, once you go through the deck 3 times, the 4th and final challenge is whatever overlord is associated with the current dungeon that you are exploring. The base game alone comes with 5 different dungeons and 5 different masterminds, overlord bosses, and it also comes with 5 different heroes. So it's a good little mix, a good little variety there. As well, we have the Shadows of the Forest, I believe, standalone expansion, which adds more heroes, dungeons, and bosses to the game. Really cool system, simple, neat, easy to set up, does not take a lot of table space, easy to travel with, and at the same time, I highly enjoy it. My number 9 dungeon crawl game of all time, One Deck Dungeon. Now we move on to my number 8, and my number 8 here is Dungeons and Dragons, the Castle of Ravenloft. And this here is the first game of the series, of the D&D Adventure series, a series of board games that Wizards of the Coast has put out. And basically, I think there's 6 games there now. And these are basically taking the D&D Dungeons and Dragons tabletop role-playing experience and turning it into a board game. And they do a really, really good job. This, I believe, is compatible with 4E, 4th edition. And basically, every player takes on the role of a hero. And I think the base game comes with 5 different options for heroes. And it's a fully cooperative game. And there's 11 quests that are in this game. I believe the first couple boxes did not allow for campaign style play, but some of the future iterations did introduce campaign play. I believe Temple of Elemental Evil or Tomb of Annihilation added and introduced campaign play to this system of games. But this system is nice and very neat. Each player has their different daily abilities. They have their utility abilities. They have special powers that they can trigger once throughout the course of an entire day or an entire quest, an entire scenario. They have other powers that they can trigger multiple times, and timing and deciding when is the right time to choose among these different decisions, that's very, very crucial. You also have a certain amount of hit points that you have to account for each character. And what's interesting about this game is that you can level up your character in mid-game one time. If one time you are able to roll a d20, a natural d20, and you have enough experience points from having defeated enough monsters, you'll be able to level up your character to level 2. There's only 2 levels in this game, and that character will have a little bit more upgraded stats. They'll have a little bit more hit points and a little bit more attack value, a slightly higher armor class. Really cool. If you like D&D and you want to have a board game experience, this is a great option. My number 8 dungeon crawl game of all time, The Castles of Ravenloft. My number 7 dungeon crawl game of all time is HeroQuest by Come On Games. And this here is pretty much as simple as a dungeon crawl as you can get. Very basic, very reminiscent of HeroQuest in its simplicity, and even cartoonish as far as its chibi style of miniatures and artwork, and presentation and graphic design. It's definitely lighthearted in its spirit. Even the narrative that goes behind all the different quests and scenarios that players partake in is very, very lighthearted. Basically, on a turn, players have 2 things they can do. They can move and they can attack. But they have 3 different heroes that they can choose from. Each player has their own individual band of heroes. So that's kind of cool. It's kind of neat. So you might have an elf, you might have a warrior, you might have a mage, whatever it might be. You can have your little mix of band of heroes and you go on your quest. And basically, it's kind of like a race. There's usually 2 or 3 objectives that players are trying to accomplish from quest to quest, from scenario to scenario, and whoever is the first player to accomplish it is the winner of that particular scenario. And then at the end of each scenario, you have a little bit of an upgrade phase where you go shopping based on the money you might have accrued throughout that quest, and you buy some additional items, some weapons that will level up your character and make them stronger for future quests, for future scenarios. The cool thing about this game too is, though your characters die multiple times, they're revived, they're resurrected, but for each death that your character suffers, they're gonna have to draw death cards at the end of each quest. And these death cards are detrimental cards that are gonna occupy some of your character's slots that could have been occupied by weapons instead. And quite often, these death cards not only occupy space, but quite often they give you detrimental effects, like perhaps they might lower your character's hit points by 1, or they might prevent you from doing some other thing as far as gameplay is concerned. It's really cool. The campaign is neat and quick. There's a bunch of different scenarios you could partake, but you do six different scenarios, and that's the completion of a campaign. So it's pretty quick and pretty feasible to do. Games are not necessarily that long themselves, so probably in the course of a weekend, if you really wanted to, you could actually go through the entire course of a campaign. The miniatures are nice looking, the artwork is great, just a fun game to play. My number 7 dungeon crawl game of all time, HeroQuest. And now we move on to my number 6. And my number 6 dungeon crawl game of all time is Heroes of Terranoff. And here again, we have a card-based game where, and this is basically a re-implementation of Warhammer Quest, I believe it was called, the card game by Fantasy Flight, to say, Adam and Brady Sadler. They are the designers of this game. And this was re-implemented with the Terranoff universe from Fantasy Flight line of games. And I'm a big fan of the Terranoff universe, so I'm okay with that. I don't necessarily have any connection with the Warhammer universe, although I know that it's very highly popular. But right here, players take on different characters, and the cool thing is that all their actions are governed by 4 different cards that each character has. Each character has 1 card that allows them to partake in combat, 1 card that allows them to explore, 1 card that allows them to assist, to help out other players or characters around the table, and 1 card that allows them to heal. And depending on their class type will determine whether or not they're better at one versus the other. So the fighter will obviously be better at fighting, and the cleric will be better at healing, and what have you. The rogue characters will be better at exploring. But what's cool about this game is that when you use these different actions, these 4 different cards, these 4 different types of actions, you rotate the card 90 degrees to indicate that it's been exhausted, and it cannot be used until it's refreshed. And to refresh a card, there's particular things you have to do. There's one card, usually your healing card, that allows you to refresh all your cards. So until you use your healing card, you can't get some of those action back. So it kind of forces you to not be able to repetitively do the same thing over and over again. So timing is very crucial. And it's so neat because players have these different enemies, some that are lurking in the shadows, some that are currently engaged with them. And there's different ways of partaking in combat, attacking players who are near or enemies who are nearby, or maybe attacking an opponent's enemy, or maybe engaging an enemy that's in the shadows, lurking in the shadows, bringing them to you and engaging them. There's ways of doing ranged combat, or perhaps attacking multiple monsters at the same time. So it's really cool to just figure out and puzzle things together and figure out how you can accomplish the particular scenario that is at hand. There is no campaign play that I'm aware of. The game does come with 7 different scenarios, so I think that's cool. That's some decent variety. It would be nice and neat if they had expansion content for this game, but don't expect it. It's been out for a while, and there is no indication that there will ever be any expansion content for this game. As a matter of fact, there are rumblings that the Brady and Adam Sadler are trying to recreate this game with a new independent IP attached to it. So we'll see if that ever actually comes to realization. But really cool. I like the Turn-Off universe. I like the gameplay, the card aspect of it all. Really neat. My number 6 dungeon crawl of all time, Heroes of Turn-Off. And now we move on to my top 5, the cream of the crop, the best dungeon crawlers of all time as far as I'm concerned. And my number 5 is Eldritch Horror. And this game here is part of the huge Arkham File line of games that Fantasy Flight puts out. You got Arkham Horror, you got Mansions of Madness, you got the LCG. This game here is my game of choice, especially for this category of games. And I'm lumping them up with these dungeon crawl games because you have a group of heroes, in this case referred to as investigators, and they're out there fighting the monsters, fighting the bad guys, fighting the big bad, the ultimate bosses, the elder ones, the ancient gods. And they are also, in the meantime, going shopping, accruing items and weapons. They're leveling up their characters. They're increasing their stats, going to these having these different encounters in different parts of the world so that they can improve their strength and their will and all their different attributes. Really cool. The immersiveness from the encounter cards in particular, when you go on these different encounters and you resolve these encounter cards and the narrative text that's found therein, really cool, really brings you into the spirit, really weaves in all of these different tropes and concepts and ideas from the Lovecraftian universe, the Lovecraftian lore, and again, really gets you into that experience. The cooperative play is cool, it's neat, you're traveling through the world. I love games that include that realistic, tangible element of travel, and you have this board that consists of a map of the world. Really neat. I just always have a good experience playing this game solo, sometimes controlling multiple characters. I enjoy playing this game with one other player, a group of players. I do not want to play with too many people, but I think maybe around 4 people is where I would cut it off. But it's fun playing it anywhere from 1 to 4 players. My number 5 dungeon crawl game of all time, Eldritch Horror. And now we move on to my number 4. My number 4 is Thunderstone Quest. And this game here is the 3rd iteration of Thunderstone. And basically at this point, they made it a full-out dungeon crawl style game. It started off as simply a deck builder, kind of like Dominion, very static deck builder, but with this kind of underlying dungeon crawl feel to it. And then they just made it a straight up dungeon crawl. They have 2 boards. One consists of the village. The other board or group of boards is the actual dungeon, starting with the wilderness and all the different dungeon rooms that the players will traverse and move into. And all of these rooms are populated with different monsters. You got level 1 monsters, level 2 monsters, level 3 monsters. And ultimately at the end of the game, you got to fight the big bad, the boss, whatever the boss might be for the particular scenario. And the base game alone comes with 2 scenarios. I think there's a 3rd for those who are Kickstarter backers. And the game has produced lots of expansions since. So there's so many different scenarios you can use to mix and match different hero combinations, different bosses, different weapons, items, and spells, different monsters that you want to fight, different classes and types of monsters you want to fight, different classes and types of heroes that you want to choose from. So much combination and variety in this game. It's really cool. I'm a big fan of the deck building genre, and I'm a big fan of the dungeon crawl genre. And this game found a way to combine the two in a very neat, smooth, and exciting way. I love the idea of the deck building being very streamlined, because instead of having these very grandiose, large, gigantic, gargantuan decks that you can never find the right card, the card that you're looking for, in this game, because you have this leveling up process, that whenever you get a higher valued hero, you're doing it through the leveling up process. So what happens is you simply destroy or remove the lower valued hero from your deck, and you replace it with the next leveled hero. So you get rid of a level 1 and you replace it with a level 2. So your deck always stays small and manageable and kind of easy to anticipate, kind of easy to predict. It's just a matter of, can you keep wounds out of your deck? Can you clear them at a fast enough pace so that you can get to the cards that you worked so hard to acquire and accrue throughout the game? My number 4 dungeon crawl game of all time, Thunderstone Quest. My number 3 dungeon crawl game of all time is Dragonfire. And Dragonfire here is a re-implementation of Shadowrun Crossfire, which is a deck building game based on a very popular RPG game. And this here is also based on a very popular tabletop RPG, namely Dungeons and Dragons. And yes, this here has a Dungeons and Dragons theme. It's a deck building game, just like Thunderstone Quest earlier. I'm a big fan of deck building games. And it's a fully cooperative game where, whether you're playing solo, 1 player, or all the way to the full complement of 6 players, you got to make sure that all 4 classes, the 4 main classes in this game, are represented in each individual scenario. So you're going to have 1 fighter, 1 cleric, 1 wizard, and 1 rogue. And what's interesting about this game is that each scenario is divided into 3 scenes. And at the beginning of each scene, there's a little bit of upkeep that takes place. You reveal a certain amount of encounter cards from the encounter deck, and you place them clockwise, 1 at a time, in front of each player. So each player has certain things that they're engaged with. And these encounter cards can include locations that basically separate a hero from the rest of the band, or they include monsters, bad guys that these heroes have to account for, fight, and defeat before moving on to other things. Now, it's really cool because the deck building has different types of cards that benefit some classes more than others. So for example, there's cards that a fighter would benefit more from than other players. So they might draft these martial type of cards in order to strengthen their deck, because they'll get more from it than another player. However, at the same time, other players might want a few of those martial cards because they need a few of those type of cards in their deck to resolve and defeat some of the bad guys that they're encountered or engaged with. So that's something to keep in mind. There are some assist cards that allow players to play cards outside of the turn in order to help someone else around the table. I find that to be really cool, and it enhances the cooperative experience. Sometimes cooperative games are cooperative in the sense that players all have a common objective, but there's very little that they can do to actually interact with and or help each other. That's not the case in this game. There's a lot that you can do in order to help someone else around the table. In particular, those assist cards are very helpful. Really cool. Lots of options as far as the different characters that you can play with, the different races, the different classes that you can choose from to start the game. The base game alone comes with a good amount of quests. There is a full campaign introduced in this base game alone, and there's tons of expansion content out there, adding future character class options, adding additional adventures and scenarios that players can go on, adding additional magic spells and items and weapons that players can accrue and acquire throughout the deck building process. My number 3 dungeon crawl game of all time, Dragonfire. Now we move on to my number 2, and my number 2 is Runebound 2nd edition. And people who have been watching this channel know how much I love this game. I adore this game. It's a great, wonderful experience for me. At the same time, I must admit that a lot of it for me is the fact that I play it solo. I play it at my pace, and I play it the way I want to play it, with some official variants and some solo modifications, individual personal preferences of mine to enhance my personal experience. But I just love exploring this world. You're just basically navigating this map that consists of lots of different wilderness areas and city areas that players are going through to go on different adventures, fight different bad guys, different monsters. Ultimately, you get lots of money from fighting these bad guys. You go to the city, you shop for allies, you shop for items and weapons to strengthen your character. You get experience points every time you defeat these monsters, and eventually when you have enough experience points, you can turn them in to level up your character in one particular stat, maybe their health, maybe their mind stat, maybe their body stat, maybe their spirit stat, and that will help them and increase their chances of being successful at different combat styles. This game is just really, really cool. I love the movement mechanism where you roll 5 dice, and based on the different terrain types that are found on the board and how they match with the different dice you roll, that tells you where you can move to, and it really limits you and frustrates you at times, but at the same time it's just an exciting process of trying to figure out how can I get to a place on the board that's helpful to me based on the dice that I rolled. Really cool, really neat, obviously inspired by games like Talisman, which I mentioned earlier, but it's definitely a more modern implementation of that style of game, and definitely grants a player much more options. And in particular, I picked 2nd edition. I do enjoy 3rd edition as well. I am rare in that sense that I like both games, but 2nd edition definitely has more content for it, and I find the conflict resolution in this game to be a little bit more satisfying than the token casting that takes place in 3rd edition. My number 2 dungeon crawl game of all time, Runebound. And that's it, folks. We move on to my number 1. And even though I think I might like Runebound overall more than my number 1, as a dungeon crawl game in particular with more than one person, this is the game I have to choose, and that is Descent. Also from Fantasy Flight Games, also within the Terranoff universe. This game here is, for many years, was the staple, the benchmark for dungeon crawl games in the hobby. Lots of new games have taken its place in that sense, including the number 1 game on BoardGameGeek.com, Gloomhaven. But for many years, Descent was the standard bearer. And this game here basically has the one versus all model, which is found in some of the games that I've mentioned on this list, in particular HeroQuest, which I mentioned in my honorable mentions earlier. One player takes on the role of the Dungeon Master or the Overlord, controlling all the forces of evil, and the other players take on the role of the characters, the heroes in this game. The cool thing about Descent is that it actually adapts to the player count. So unlike HeroQuest and games like Arcadia Quest or Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles or even Dragonfire, you're not limited to the amount of heroes or classes that can be in the game. You could have as little as 2. If you play with just one human opponent, you do need to have at least 2, but you could have 2, 3, or 4 according to the player count. And basically this is a campaign-based game. Each box, the base game and any subsequent expansion, introduces new campaigns that players can go through, quest by quest, encounter by encounter, ultimately trying to accomplish whatever final objective is in the final quest. And it's so cool because characters are searching for items. Each scenario feels different from the other. The end game condition or the winning objective for each scenario feels different. It's very asymmetric. While there is some overlap between what the Overlord is trying to do and what the heroes are trying to do, it's definitely different enough. Their objectives are definitely distinguished from one another. And it's really cool how players can level up their characters in between sessions, in between quests, by going to the shop and using the gold that they've accrued from previous quests in order to buy different items, or they can use their experience points that they've been accruing throughout the course of the campaign and spend those experience points for more powerful skill cards that enhance their character's abilities. Really cool. The miniatures are nice. Lots of expansion content for this game. I'm pretty sure they are now done with this game and they're moving on to Descent Legends in the Dark. But for its time, this game was king of the hill. My number 1 dungeon crawl game of all time, Descent. And that's it for today's list, folks. As you can see, lots of games that perhaps you were expecting to hear were not mentioned on this list. In particular, I'm going to make reference to Gloomhaven. I have yet to play Gloomhaven, so I apologize for that. Gloomhaven, however, is a game that's going to be hitting the table soon in this household, and perhaps it might shuffle things here around. But for the time being, these are my favorite games in this particular genre. Comment down below and tell me what you think about this genre. What's your favorite dungeon crawl game of all time? I'm interested in reading what you guys have to say. This is Harry saying take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.